What's up, YouTube? So I've done a couple of videos, touching on some of the basics of mixing elements, what certain processes mean, how they work, and, where you would generally use them. Stuff like EQ, compression, that kind of thing. But I don't think I've quite drilled down the importance of some of these tasks. And I also don't think I've kind of shed enough light on some of them. So I've decided to, go back and to do a sort of complete mixing course, everything that I think you need to know to sort of arm yourselves with enough knowledge to mix your own tracks. So the first few episodes, I'm going to be looking at EQing, a couple of different techniques, and a couple of different things you should take note of when using EQs. So let's dive in and have a look. Today's episode is basic EQing for separating different parts in your mix. So I've set up a bit of a track here purely for the purpose of this demonstration. I've kind of stayed away from mixing any of the elements. I think the kick and bass and percussions, it's a template that I sometimes use so that the mix is already kind of started there, so there's not much work that needs to be done there. But the synths I've kind of left bare because I think that's something that a lot of guys struggle with. There's so many tutorials on how to get the perfect kick and bass sound, how to get the perfect drum sound. But specifically with Psytrance, there's not many tutorials about, placing different synth elements and different kind of lead elements effectively in a sort of 3D space. So I kind of wanted to work on that and kind of concentrate on that and show you guys a couple of sort of key mixing techniques that I use when sort of cleaning up my synth parts and stuff like that. These ideas still apply to pretty much any elements. I mean, I'll kind of show you guys what I'm talking about with a couple of examples with some drum sounds and stuff just now. But just to get things started, the drums and kick and bass and stuff are already kind of loosely mixed. So I'm just going to kind of dive in here with the leads and synths and show you guys a couple of fundamental things about EQs today. So I've discussed this in a previous tutorial, and it's the idea that I think the most important thing that an EQ is used for is to combat something called frequency conflict. And that's the idea that, two sounds that are occupying the same frequency domain will muddy up the sound in that domain. And if you EQ these elements to fit into each of their own domain, you're going to get a sort of much cleaner sound. So I'm going to kind of go over the basics and show you an example and also show you something that's probably been covered in quite a few videos, but I'm going to give you quite a few examples to sort of really try to drill down this fact. So this is the kick and bass and percussions that I've prepped for this tutorial. And I'm going to show you guys on a scope. So notice how the low end is predominantly in mono. So there's minimal phase happening in the low end. So if you haven't seen my episode on what phase is, I'm going to post a link in the description. I'm also going to post a link to another couple of tutorials that I think you should maybe watch before watching this video. But anyway, so this is the scope, and I'm going to play what the kick and bass sounds like, and you're going to get a quick grasp of what it looks like on the scope as well. This is the Flux Studio Analyzer. So notice that you've got a phase correlation meter over here, but the cool thing about this is it shows you the frequency content and where the phase is kind of going out. So notice that in the low end, it's almost entirely in mono. And the result is like what we're hearing on the speakers. I mean, it might not be perfect because this is just an example, but the bass line is very stable and it kind of has the same almost tone every time the bass is played. So this is due to the fact that there is no phasing happening in the low end, or there's no other sort of sounds clashing with that frequency spectrum to kind of muddy up. So notice how the frequency spectrum is quite full on the low and mid range, but there's a gap kind of missing in the top end. But at the same time, there's very little happening in the stereo spectrum. So I'm going to sort of dive a little bit deeper into mid-side EQ and spacing stuff out in that regard in the next episode. But just take that into account with that reference over there. So I'm going to sort of explain things in, limiting sounds to a particular space. But don't think that you're confined only to that space, because I'm going to kind of take things into onto the next level in the next episode. So you guys are going to get a little bit more of a grasp. But just for the simplicity of this tutorial, take into account that sort of frequency shape of the spectrum of the kick and bass and percussions all playing together. So now I'm going to play you the solo of my synth sound over here. This is like my main lead that I've quickly just prepped for this tutorial. So something I didn't pick up, or this is kind of planned, so just imagine if you were in my shoes. When I was creating the synth lead, the full frequency sound sounded great. But then I kind of wanted to create movement, like I've explained in a previous tutorial. So I put a filter on, and only then did I realize how much low end there was in the actual synth sound itself. And not only low end, but did you notice on that, on the phase correlation meter, there was a lot of phasing happening in the low end. If we layer the synth into our track willy-nilly without taking into account EQ and frequency conflict, it's probably going to end up sounding pretty messy. I'm going to show you guys what I'm talking about. Not only have we lost a lot of the kind of energy in the low end of our bass, we've also kind of created this kind of movement. And that's due in part to what I was explaining in the phase tutorial, or the sort of walkthrough on what exactly phase is, because you're getting that kind of variation in the amplitude of that low end because you've got these multiple waves overlapping and creating these phase differences. So the easiest way to combat that is with a high pass EQ on the synth channel. That way separating those frequency spectrums, you know, the kick and bass and percussions are then taking up your mid-range and your low frequencies, while the synths are then going to take up your mids and high frequencies. And the balance is that balance between the kind of percussions and the synths in the mid-range. And, you know, I think in the mid-range you've got a lot more space to work with in terms of phasing, because it's not as audible as in your low end. You know, in the low end you can pretty much pick it up instantaneously. I mean, if you couldn't pick it up in that example there, I'd probably recommend getting better headphones or better monitors or something like that. Or at least reference a lot more examples and train your ear a little bit more. But anyway, so the idea here is I want to cut out the low end from my synth, but I don't want to take out too much so that the synth is kind of inaudible or it loses its kind of power. So the idea here is not to spend too much time working on the synth while it's soloed, because that way you kind of miss these parts as you EQ them out. So it kind of helps to reference it while the track is playing and while the synth is soloed, and jump between those two. So I'm just going to keep things simple, and I'm going to use the channel EQ that's in Cubase. There's obviously better EQs out there with, you know, more parameters. Cubase itself even has plugins that you can load with more parameters, but I'm just going to keep things simple for this tutorial. I want to show you guys the basics of what sort of stuff to look out for. Let's set this to high pass over here and turn it on. And I kind of like, by rule of thumb, I like to EQ my synths at around 250 to 300 hertz, maybe sometimes lower if I want that kind of low-end growliness. But I kind of start by setting it at 250 and either move it up or down from there. And if that's not enough kind of cut, then what I'll do is I'll look at this low cut and add one of these steeper curves like this to really kind of cut out that low end. But let's have a reference of what the difference is with and without the EQ compared to while it's playing with the kick and bass. So it's already instantly better. That bass has a lot more stability, and you notice on the phase correlation meter, there's no phase issues happening between the synth and the low end of the track anymore. So I like to apply this theory not only to synths versus kick and bass, I like to apply this theory to most of the elements. So this is another example that I want to show you guys, another example that I threw together. Kind of more of a minimal tech kind of track. I've added in these toms that I've sampled from a 909 VST, and they've got a lot of low end in them, and they're kind of like conflicting with the kick and bass, and there's a couple of other things that I want to outline as well, but I just want to kind of show you guys quickly first, why it's so important, and I want to show you a couple of different situations so that you understand that it's not like the exact frequencies for like specific instruments, like there isn't an exact frequency to cut for a kick and no exact frequency to cut for a bass, etc., etc. It's very much got to do with the content that you're working on and the particular track that you're working on. So I figured showing you guys a couple of examples is going to be powerful. So anyway, this is what we've got so far. So by ear, when you listen to those toms, it doesn't sound like there's a lot of low end in there. But when you look at it on a frequency spectrum, I'm actually just going to pull up Flux Analyzer, just because it's a lot more visual. So if we have a look on the scope here, we're going to see that it's got a lot of low end in it. And I think what's happening is there's kind of like a boost in the mids and highs that kind of masks the amount of low end that's happening in that sound. So we're going to try counteract that with EQ, but let's have a listen and a look at what's happening with this exact sound on the frequency spectrum over here. So, like I said, it's going even down as low as into like the sub range there. There's like some 60 hertz and stuff that is showing up on the scope. So obviously that's going to kind of conflict with the low end, the kick and bass and stuff like that. So let's have a look at just the kick and bass on the spectrum analyzer. So with this one, I tried to make it kind of like mostly in the subs, not much mids and highs going on with the kick and bass, so that like these toms and synths can kind of really come through in the mid-range. So I might not end up cutting as much lows as I would with like a Cytron synth or something like that. So it's good to kind of check it out on the scope and just kind of compare the two and see which frequency range they're most dominant in, for example. Most of the action in the kick and bass is kind of happening below the sort of 150 range. So what I'm going to do is let's actually just pop an EQ on here. The reason I'm putting the EQ on a channel as opposed to using this EQ here is I want to be able to control where in the chain the EQ is. And this is quite important when cutting lows out of something. I guess I could use this pre-EQ over here, but at least here I've got a little bit more control. I can cut and boost certain areas. And also, if I want to say, for example, use a delay and a reverb, now it's not passing sub-frequencies to those effects if you're cutting the EQ first. So sometimes I'll end up using an EQ first, and then afterwards I'll then carve this EQ a little bit and shape it a bit, depending on whether I want to kind of boost or post effect. And then I'll use a kind of more clinical EQ pre the effect, if that makes sense. So stuff like removing lows, finding certain frequencies and removing those and stuff, I generally do on the pre-EQ. But then if I kind of want to sweeten it up in the overall mix, I'll do that on the post-EQ. So like I said, let's cut out, let's put a high pass at about 150. So the type of slope that you use is going to change the amount of roll-off, obviously. So here, you know, on the default, I think it was like 12 or 18. There was still quite a lot of low end coming through. So what I want to do is I actually want to turn this up, create more of a curve, or maybe let's go for something like 175 or so hertz. Let's see how this sounds and looks on the scope. So now I think what's happening is, again, there's kind of like this, a lot of, like I mentioned, a lot of mid-highs coming through. And that's masking the sort of low-mid punchiness of these toms. So what we can do is we can put a high shelf style EQ and, you know, find the sweet spot here to accentuate this range. Because obviously, you know, here in this range, we want to have hi-hats and those kind of things cutting through. So you don't necessarily always have to cut completely. You can shelf and boost ever so slight amounts as well. So that definitely works too. Check this out. So now what we want to do is we want to compare, you know, with the other percussions in and out and all sorts of stuff like that. Okay, so let's look at the kick and bass quickly. So you'll notice that the bass has this kind of like portamento up slide and then down again right at the end of the bar here. And I'm noticing that it kind of, at that part, almost, you know, clashes with the punchy frequency of the kick drum. So let's quickly compare these on a scope. So it looks like the sort of thump range was around here, and the mid-range kind of punch was around sort of 160 hertz or so. Let's just have another look so we can make sure. Yeah, so what was happening there is the bass at this kind of frequency was moving up to 160 hertz. So, you know, that you might not pick this up at first with the untrained ear, so that's why it's really important to use scopes, solo your elements, and have a look at what they look like, check the frequencies and stuff like that. But you can also kind of do it by ear. It does kind of take a bit of training and stuff like that. And you do need, obviously, really good pair of headphones or monitors or something like that. But that being said, is you can get away with doing it with scopes and just making sure that each of these elements don't have a kind of really prominent frequency that another element has. So what I want to do is I actually want to pop an EQ and dip out this 160 or so hertz range. 160. So here again, you can see that you don't necessarily have to cut a whole frequency band. You can just dip or boost a certain frequency or vice versa, depending on what you want to do. On the converse, I feel like the opposite was happening with the bass line. I feel like there was a lot of sub, and the kick is kind of punching a little bit too low in the subs. What we can do is, let's go back to the kick, check out that EQ, and we can apply a low cut to the kick. So what I actually want to do is, let's solo the kick and just check if we're missing frequencies when we kind of bypass this, and compare the big difference of like what happens when we bypass this and what happens when it's kick and bass soloed together and bypass it. And ultimately, the ideal is to, you want to get the best sound with both of them playing, obviously. But sometimes what happens is if the kick is soloed and you cut the bass out, it suddenly sounds a bit worse because you obviously have now cut out some of those sub frequencies that, kind of sound pleasing to you. So always be aware of that, bypass it, solo both, see how it goes, compare the two, reference, stuff like that. So the difference is slight, so I'm not really worried about comparing here. But you'll notice that, like specifically with this kick sound, it's not that audible, but you can kind of feel the difference in the roll-off in the low end. And I think that's the key to getting that kind of clean kick and sub bass sound together, is not to have too much of that sub in the kick. And then also not to have too much of that punchy mid-range in the sub. So let's have a listen to these now again. So you see when the frequency went up there, it kind of sounds a little bit cleaner than before we put the EQ on. But like, say for example, we've got less focused synth parts in the track, sort of atmospheric type things. I'm going to show you a couple of examples here, see if I've got them already. So I've got a sort of squelch and acid lead kind of part, and not only is there way too much low end, like I was explaining right now in the synth, that's kind of overlapping and conflicting with the low end in our track. I feel that the parts themselves are conflicting with each other. I think that the acid lead sound has a lot more of a focus in the mid-range, while the squelch has a lot more of a focus in the high range. So now what we can do is we can use EQ to kind of take those and separate them. We'll put the squelch, we'll actually put it into the high range so that there's no mids and low frequencies to conflict with the other synth and with the rest of our track, and vice versa with the acid lead sound. What I want to do is, let's actually just mute the acid sound, and I'm going to just kind of dive into the squelch sound, and let's look at EQing this guy. So one thing to note is, like, if you're struggling to find where the focus of a sound is, you can easily look at, a spectrum analyzer and kind of see where the most action or the most harmonic content in the frequency spectrum is happening. So check this out. This is the squelch sound. I'm actually just going to solo it quickly. See, if you compare those two, the squelch had like a lot more sort of harmonic excitement, I would say, happening in the high end. You could definitely see those like spikes going wild there in the high end, while the mid-range in the acid sound, you could see that was kind of the focus point. So I think that's also like the sort of key, is to be able to kind of listen to the sound and, you know, differentiate where you think that'll fit into the mix. And I think that's the creative part of mixing. You know, placing the sounds. There's so many different parameters you can choose from, but I think rather than getting too creative with things like, you know, compression, where you could so easily throw things off, I think concentrate on like placing these sounds and you know, do that, as opposed to worrying about the settings of compression and the settings of EQs and stuff like that. Is just place these sounds, you know, and I think that's going to make you a lot more of an effective mix engineer than knowing all the best settings and the best plugins and all sorts of stuff like that. But anyway, so what we'll do here is, again, quick and easy. I'm not going to go too in depth with it. I'm just going to slap a high pass on here and cut out quite a lot of the low and mid range. And then conversely, on the acid sound, let's actually just solo these two together. Let's EQ the lows out of this guy and the highs out of this guy as well. So now we've kind of, it's okay to get a bit of overlap, you know, the EQ is not going to be like an exact cut. So you kind of want to boost, you kind of want to get the focal range of each part and not so much harmonics coming through that are going to then muddy up the other element in the track, if that makes sense. So let's listen to these sounds now. And we might need to come back and carve them a little bit more in the EQ. So this is a track that I actually made a little while ago, but I figured it would be great to slot in here because it's got some cool examples to kind of outline for you guys, to kind of like drill down the facts that I'm trying to show you guys in this video. So I've kind of got the kick and bass. I've kind of got like the drums and the bass sounding pretty good. But the moment I start layering the synth sounds and the guitar sounds, there's actually guitars in this one, then it just kind of becomes a muddy mess. And when you listen to each of the synth parts alone and you start to EQ them, it kind of feels like you're missing certain elements or certain frequency ranges. But when you layer them like in entirety and you listen to the entire mix, that's when you kind of start to hear that, you know, using EQ to layer your sounds is incredibly effective. So let's just dive in here and have a listen to some of the sounds that I've just prepared here. Okay, so why is it that it sounds like a muddy mess when you layer each of these sounds over each other, but they sound okay over the kick and bass? Is that they're all very full frequency sounds. So obviously the guitar is in a lower kind of octave, then that kind of like portamento kind of slide chord is in a kind of like mid-range octave, while that arpeggiator spans quite a few octaves, although they've still got quite a lot of lows in them, and guitar, because of like the distortion and all sorts of stuff like that, is always going to have, particularly like these heavy chords, is always going to have a lot of full range sound in it. So, for example, like if we solo the guitars and then pull up our spectrum analyzer, we'll actually quickly be able to identify that. Yeah, in case you're wondering, I just put LFO tool on there to kind of give it that kind of side chainy kind of sound that suited like the rhythm of the track. So that's what that was. So in the guitars, there's quite a lot of kind of mid-range, and then there's that little kind of squeal at the high end, and I don't want to lose that. But we can, EQ a lot of the sort of lows, mids, and EQ some of the very highs out to still retain a lot of the energy in the sound, but clean up the space to allow space for other sounds in the mix. So I already kind of did some basic EQing here on the guitars, but I don't think I nailed it even close to what it should be. So let's say, for example, put on a high pass. And I like to use Butterworth just because it's got a lot of range and it's kind of rounded. There isn't much harmonic distortion that kind of gets added. Let's try a low pass, but with something like a curve like that. And let's just listen to, how much we can kind of carve out on both sides without losing too much information from that guitar sound. The rule of thumb when I'm kind of EQing out the top end is the moment it almost sounds like a filter, pull back a bit. Don't go that much. So you'll notice here, like between sort of 200 hertz and 250, you'll kind of start getting a bit of a lo-fi kind of sound, where it'll start to sound like it's lacking a little bit. However, when we layer the drums and bass back in, it might not be as apparent. So let's just check this out. I'm doing is I'm pulling out certain frequencies which I feel aren't taking away too much energy from the sound. So bear in mind, you might not want to do this in a part where it's just, one or a few instruments in like a minimal arrangement. But when you're layering stuff, it definitely helps to, like I said, create space for the other instruments in the mix. Cool. So this is sounding good. Guitars, bass, drums, everything sounding nice and layered together. Awesome. That's using EQ to create separation for different elements in your mix. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Let me know what you think in the comments. If there's any other techniques that you guys use, also maybe let me know in the comments. A big thanks to IDM Mag, proud supporters of the dance music scene and my channel. If you like what I do and you want to support me, check out the links to Patreon somewhere on the screen right now. As always, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. See you guys next time.